So let me give you a little bit of background about Ben. He founded SportsTradex in 2012. After years of experience as an entrepreneur and commodities trader, he started his first business at age 13 and ran that company profitably for 10 years, being recognized as the 2002 Maryland Youth Entrepreneur of the Year. Ben also worked as a commodities trader for 5 years, and he has his MBA from the University of Texas. But after business school, Ben founded SportsTradex to provide fun, one-day fantasy sports games and deliver new ways for sports fans to engage with their favorite teams and players. So SportsTradex will reach over 10,000 users and generate over $3 million in entry fees this year. So I'd like to have your attention and give it to Ben, and he'll tell you all about a new form of fantasy sports, SportsTradex. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. And boy, am I glad that there was a break before I had to follow my games. My name is Ben Lipson, and I'm the CEO and founder of SportsTradex, a daily fantasy sports game provider. We offer one-day games. We've been around for about 2.5 years, and we've raised $1.1 million to date. We're in the middle of a Series A capital raise right now. We're also an applicant. I'm from Houston, but I'm an applicant for the LA Dodgers Accelerator Program. I believe it's their first year, and there's a possibility that if we're accepted, which I think we'll know next week, that we could spend a few months here as part of that program in the Southern California area. It's a real honor and a privilege to be here today. I don't feel like I'm accomplished enough to be a keynote speaker, but I want to thank everybody that organized the event. Especially want to thank David Meltzer, Warren Moon, and Sports1Marketing. These guys have been around as advisors and partners in my business from the very beginning. When you're an entrepreneur, you're used to hearing no. I heard no from investors, no from partners, no from sports teams, no from athletes, no from women. That didn't really have anything to do with being an entrepreneur, but it's kind of a personal issue. And David Meltzer, Warren Moon, and the Sports1Marketing team said yes. They said yes to hosting my launch party for the company at the Super Bowl in New Orleans, and they've been really genuine, fantastic partners ever since. So thank you guys. Last October, I was in St. Louis at a wedding with my girlfriend, and now ex-girlfriend, but again, that goes back to the previous comment about women. We were walking around downtown St. Louis, and a guy came running up the hill toward us out of a sports bar in just his boxers. And my girlfriend had this perplexed look on her face, and as the guy passed us, he looked, grinned, shrugged, and just said, "I lost a fantasy sports bet." Fantasy sports, this story and other stories like it, really illustrate passion that users have for fantasy sports. Fantasy sports is inarguably today one of the hottest industries, not just in sports, but in the world. Just 2 days ago, between the time I sent this presentation to Jennifer here and the actual day of the event, FanDuel raised $275 million at a $1.275 billion valuation. Yahoo last week announced that they're not only going to offer traditional fantasy games, but they're also going to offer one-day real money fantasy games. Fantasy games fuel the popularity of sports leagues and contribute to outstanding live television ratings. We've heard today about how some TV might be dead, some social media might be dead, but I think it's different in the world of sports, and that's largely due both to the live nature and also the fantasy and gaming interest. So I think it's helpful to start with a few definitions. This may be elementary for a lot of people here, but fantasy sports is really a term for any competition where participants select and manage a team of athletes and compete based on that team's real-world performance, real-world statistical performance. Daily fantasy sports is a new category within that industry where the game is essentially the same, but it lasts one day. And so there's this immediate gratification. Maybe the two most fun parts about playing fantasy sports is picking your team and then, of course, winning. And daily fantasy games allow you to do that as many times as you want to with new opportunities every single day. There's a term within daily fantasy, the salary cap game, and this just refers to a game format. Essentially, you're given a certain amount of money with which to build your lineup, and each player has a price tag attached to him or her. So daily fantasy games are really driving the growth of the industry. And I think there are three primary reasons that they appeal to people. First, as we talked about as we've heard in the earlier portions of this conference, the fan experience is so critical, and sports fans are constantly looking for new ways to engage with their favorite teams and players. Fantasy sports gives them that engagement. Second, traditional fantasy games, while really popular, require a long-term commitment and suffer from attrition, while daily games appeal to both the really casual user who wants to just play once a week or even once a month, and the really hardcore user who wants to play every single day, pick a new team, maybe make multiple teams per day. Finally, sports betting is illegal outside of Las Vegas, but real money fantasy sports is legal. Why is real money fantasy sports legal? It's because of an exemption in the 2006 federal gaming laws, the Unlawful Internet Gaming Enforcement Act, that created a special exemption for fantasy sports as a skill-based game. And over the last decade, that exemption has withheld court cases and actually been more legitimized over time. So fantasy sports and daily fantasy sports companies operate under a revenue model where they take entry fees to play, they pay out cash prizes, and the site keeps a small commission for its revenue. I was at last month at the Fantasy Sports Trade Association conference. I started going to that conference about a year before I decided to start the company. And the first time I went there, I was at the bar, and there was a guy telling me about his 2005 fantasy team, and he somehow overlooked Adrian Peterson with the second overall pick. There are very few things that people care less about than your own fantasy team. I think it's a kind of a credit to the changes in the industry that now when I go, that guy's never there. It's big data, it's big media, it's social media, it's credit card processing companies, Facebook, Twitter. It's turned into a technology conference, and every year the FSTA releases a new research report. These numbers are brand new. There are now 57 million fantasy sports players in the US and Canada. That's up 35% from just last year. The daily fantasy sports market is exhibiting even more impressive growth. So spending in this market has gone from $90 in 2012 to almost $500 in 2015. And over that same time period, for the whole industry, that's a 400% increase. But for the daily fantasy sports industry, it's over 1,600%. So you can see pretty clearly that the numbers show that the daily fantasy sports market is truly exploding. And this is just another illustration of that same point. They represent a disproportionately large amount of the market spending, but it has still only penetrated a really tiny portion of total users. I just mentioned there are 57 million users in the US and Canada. maybe 4 to 5 million of them are playing daily fantasy sports. So as awareness builds, marketing in the industry increases, and money comes into these companies to create awareness and to convert users from traditional fantasy sports to one-day fantasy sports, I think it's fully reasonable to expect that the growth will continue along the same lines of the last 3 years. There are $3 billion plus companies in this space already. FanDuel, DraftKings, and Yahoo, who just recently announced that they're going to enter with real money one-day games. They've had investments from companies like KKR, huge venture capital firms, partnerships with the NBA and Major League Baseball. This has really built a tremendous amount of legitimacy and awareness and growth for the entire industry. A rising tide is truly lifting all boats. But they all offer one type of game, the salary cap game I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So I think in terms of game formats, we can expect to see a lot of innovation in the way that it's played. And SportsTradex differentiates itself in a number of ways. One of them is with the product or the game format itself, because the game truly is the product. And I would say there's nothing inherently better about what they offer. It's been very popular and it's great. It will continue to be successful. But users, when surveyed by us at SportsTradex, report that one of the main reasons that they play at SportsTradex is because it's an alternative, it's unique, it's something different. And there's this interesting characteristic of the business, of the industry, unlike where your internet provider, you would only ever have one. There's an economic disincentive to more than that. In the world of fantasy sports, people play 4, 5, 6 different sites. And the reason they play us alongside FanDuel, DraftKings, Yahoo is because primarily the games are different. So without boring you too much on the details of the game formats, I will say that we have a number of different games, some of which mirror more traditional fantasy games, but they're only one day in length, and some that actually occur in real time. So you're playing fantasy during a game, making changes during the game, making predictions, and capitalizing on the success or the increased likelihood of that prediction coming to fruition in the middle of the game. These games for us have contributed $1.35 million in gross entry fees collected last year, and we're on pace actually for $4 million in 2015. If you look at a very successful company like FanDuel, sorry, let me go back, and compare it over a similar time period to our growth, we've seen the same thing. So there are $3 billion companies in the space, but I think that both the low penetration rate that we've seen up until now, plus just the nature of the business, creates room for a lot more companies to be successful in this space. Probably the most important metrics when you're looking at a business like this are the customer acquisition costs and the lifetime value of a customer. And these numbers here are probably the thing that make me most optimistic about the future of SportsTradex, and I should say they're pretty similar to every other competitor in the space. And so one of the reasons we're raising money is because we're looking just to fuel that marketing channel and to bring on a critical mass of users to continue to scale up in what is a very scalable business. So I mentioned some of the big developments recently. I'll just go over a few more highlights. Yahoo obviously entered. DraftKings has formed partnerships with the MLB. They're forming partnerships with other stadiums to create an in-stadium experience like the Staples Center. ESPN created an exclusive marketing deal with DraftKings, and they actually added last month a daily fantasy sports analyst to their SportsCenter broadcast. New York Times, Wall Street Journal consistently reporting on the growth of the daily fantasy sports business, and a few predictions on what I think we'll see going forward and where SportsTradex is going. I think the NFL has probably been the biggest beneficiary of season-long games. The MLB, the NBA, other leagues, while very popular, don't really fit in terms of schedule into that fantasy game quite as well. And so you don't see the season-long participation rates for those leagues that you might see for the NFL. But daily changes everything. I think daily games can do for Major League Baseball and for the NBA what traditional Yahoo, ESPN leagues did for the NFL. And then it's an experience thing. It's not just about the fantasy companies being able to benefit on the popularity of the industry. Levi Stadiums has a fantasy lounge in the stadium. And in Houston, SportsTradex has now partnered with sports bars in the area to run fantasy sports nights that are mirrored off of the bar trivia night concept. So instead of coming into a sports bar and playing trivia, why not come in and play a game where the clientele is typically more interested in sports anyway. The bar benefits from increased revenue, from beer sales, from people staying around longer, and SportsTradex is picking up users with a really unique marketing approach that I think to this point has been really untapped. So we're starting to explore that more and more and expand that program. And then I think you'll see a huge round of merger and acquisition activity. This space reminds me a little bit of what traditional fantasy sports was when it first went online, and there were 6 to 8 really successful companies, and then through acquisition and through this race to the top, you saw ESPN, Yahoo, and other big media companies buying them up. So I think you'll see that, and I think you'll see a lot of successful winners in the space all end up as part of 2 or 3 long-term successful fantasy providers. I have a very talented team in Houston. I just want to acknowledge them before I conclude the presentation. I couldn't do it without these guys, and I wanted to leave as much time as possible for Q&A because I think people are probably getting tired of the sound of my voice. So if there are any questions, feel free. I don't know how much time is left, but I'm sure hopefully a little bit, and then, okay, about 5 minutes. So I'll take a couple of questions and then we'll move on to somebody more exciting.
A business-related question. Since you guys are already funded during your Series A, why did you think it was advantageous to apply to an accelerator group?
Yeah, I would never apply to an ordinary accelerator. But the LA Dodgers accelerator was so perfectly tailored to what we're doing and so focused on the sports world that I felt like it made sense. So I think we're probably a little far advanced. I don't know if that will help or hurt our chances, but because it was so focused on sports tech with such an unbelievable mentorship and networking program, I felt like it was worth doing.
Thank you.
Dave.
But what do you think, the motivator for people for fantasy, do you think it's the money side of things or just the involvement and interaction with the game? And what percentage would you say?
Yeah, I think for the majority of our users, it's about entertainment and having fun and maybe a little bit more engagement. But that's probably 90% of the users. The other 10%, especially in the daily space, are really focused on the opportunity to make money. But they also consider it a skill to which they devote a lot of time and research. So I had a trading background. I came from a commodities trading background, and you see finance guys applying the same modeling to picking their players that they did to deciding on investments. And those are the guys that contribute the most to our revenue. So I think the user base is split into 2 categories. The casual guys that are interested in the entertainment, the fun, and just watching the game. And then the guys that really are interested in the science behind it, the math and stats, that are doing it to make money. And for us, the top 10% of users, which are those kinds of users, actually contribute 90% of our total revenue.
You said the big spend was going to be marketing going forward to hit the 4 million. What are the other big costs that you incur in the business?
We incur marketing costs, development costs, which are just our human resources, and then the prizes that we pay out to winners. But really, that's covered by the entry fees. So you're talking about a very scalable business. The margins are small, so that's why we're really interested in going from 4 million to hopefully 15 million in 2016, up to maybe 100 million the following year.
What about legal costs?
Initially, there were plenty of legal costs. We feel really comfortable with the legal environment right now. Most of our legal costs are no longer on defending the legality of the company, more on doing paperwork on the actual deals for raising money.
Is this just in America, or do you have any global appeal?
There's potential for global appeal, but right now it's geographically restricted to the US and Canada. It's interesting because it's a legal skill-based game here that doesn't constitute gambling. You could operate in Europe, but you would operate as a gambling operator, which increases some of the regulatory concerns and just changes the licensing requirements. So nobody's entered that space yet because it's counterintuitive, but it's actually harder to break into that market. Thank you all very, very much. I hope to get a chance to talk to you and have a couple of drinks when the whole program is over.